I think Chiara is there. Amazing.
Hello, sorry,
Michael, do you want?
Can you hear me well?
Yes, working
Yes.
perfectly.
Hi, Chiara.
May we start? Let everyone enter, and Michael, I give you go.
Yeah. Hey everyone, very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us for today's webinar. We should be able to start. Maybe we can wait for a few seconds and just to let everyone in joining the call. My name is Michael Bilaro. I'm the regional representative for CoP based in Manila. And we welcome you all for today's webinar. So I think we can kick off. So as mentioned, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CBA Climate Environment Community of Practice. This is the first webinar of this communities of practice this year. And should you want to be engaged and know more about the communities of practice and resources, and know more about the resources, head out to COP's webpage for the communities of practice resources. So today's webinar, we're focusing on a particularly pressing and complex issue, which is loss and damage. As we all know, climate change is already impacting communities globally, more so in Asia and the Pacific, leading to displacement, economic hardship, irreversible losses. And these impacts are not just future projections, no? They are present reality. And for today's webinar, we wanted to explore and delve into the critical issues around loss and damage and the opportunities to use cash and vouchers as part of the solution. But before we do that, next slide, please. Let's have a quick housekeeping. Next slide. So this webinar will run for 60 minutes. We will try our very best to manage the time. The webinar is recorded. You will be able to receive the recording available on COP website. Since we are in a webinar, you are muted. But should you want to engage and speak, kindly raise your hands later on. We'll have time for a space for discussions. And unfortunately, we were not able to do a live translation for today's webinar. Next slide, please. Yeah, kindly before we start, can you ensure that you are on mute? You'll find a Q&A box in your at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type in your questions as we go along with the presentations of our esteemed panel of speakers and experts. And we'll be able to go back to the questions later on at the end of the presentations. Next slide, please. So for today's agenda, just a quick rundown. We'll have a quick welcome and a quick introduction. We will explore loss and damage, background and fundamentals. What do we really mean by loss and damage? I'm also new to this space, so I don't know much about loss and damage. And the intersection on cash and loss and damage discussions. We also have reflections from panel of experts, especially in terms of how this affect our practice in the humanitarian sector. And lastly, we'll have we will need an alignment of messaging on the funds in response to loss and damage board and the contribution from the audience and next steps. And to kick us off, I'll give the floor to Celine to give us an overview of this initiative.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. We glad to have you today. So it's the second webinar on the topic. Yesterday was pretty interesting, and we hope to have time with you to discuss a bit and have feedback from you as an audience. So today, overarching question is how can cash transfer play an integrated role in addressing loss and damage? We understand loss and damage as negative impact of climate change that occur despite of the absence of mitigation or adaptation. Next slide, please. CALP is definitely focusing historically on the use of cash in humanitarian response. But as you see, instead of the word cash, we try to enlarge that a little bit and have also the analysis of the use in cash in relation of the climate crisis, underlining the need to consider more holistically how, where, and when cash can play a role. This includes respect to climate, GRR financing stream. So we are super pleased to partnering with Give Directly, and Isabelle Pellet is there with us to do that, on their initiative on the role of cash in the loss and damage fall within this broader perspective from CALP on cash and climate. Thinking about cash transfer delivered both by governments, international and national organizations, and have been used in many contexts to help people prepare or cope or recover from climate impact. So we are definitely working on the need arising from climate shock in the humanitarian setting, and can be used to support key aspects of the LND, including recovery, rehabilitation, and resilience building. Next slide, please. So for framing a bit the discussion of today, a bit of background, so definitely Give Directly have this case study on the Cyclone Freddy in Malawi in 2023. It was under LND funding, lump sum cash transfer funding by the Scottish government. So Isabelle will come back on that because it was the case studies that initiated everything. Then we have the Give Directly principle on cash for LND, which was launched at the CoP in Baku last November, and will be also quickly summarized in the coming presentation. Then we have the FRLD board that has been established and formed, but disbursement of the fund is yet to start with upcoming decision on operational modality. The background will be explained a bit more in Kara's presentation, and they're now preparing to start initial pilot disbursal of fund. Of course, we have also this collective opportunity at the moment as cash experts, climate experts to advocate for cash within this pilot intervention for this year and the next one, with a common objective with cash is seen as highly effective and local solution for loss and damage. And since January, Give Directly with support of CALS and roundtable of experts on the topic to review the principle, discuss what might be the key messaging to advocate for on the use of cash to present to support. And now I will leave the floor, sorry, next slide, please, to our great speakers that we have with us today. So we have Chiara Ligori from Oxfam working on the loss and damage that will present you through all of that. And then we have two experts joining us, so Chris Sharma from CALP and Jamie McGondon from Scottish Government. And Chiara, I think it will be to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so hi, thanks so much for inviting me to give a few introductory elements here. So basically, Celine already mentioned the definition of loss and damage, but if you can go into the next slide, please. I also put it here. It's not really, there's no one definition, but mostly it is understood to refer to the harms caused by climate change that go beyond adaptation. So when adaptation has not been possible, or there has been no adaptation efforts. Next slide, please. In the jargon of loss and damage, there is the difference between economic and non-economic loss and damage. If you see at the bottom of these slides, you see that economic losses and damages are considered those that are basically can be quantified and traded in markets. So loss of income, physical assets, infrastructure, and so on. And non-economic, by definition, is something that is less easy to quantify and is also not related to non-tradable assets. And so we talk about impacts on people's lives, like life, health, but also human mobility, loss of cultural identity, or a loss of biodiversity, loss of peace and security as well. And then loss and damage is caused by both extreme events, so such as storm, tropical cyclones, droughts, and so on, but also slow onset events that are by definition slow, so like desertification, glacial retreats, sea level rise, and so on. Next slide, please. Yeah, here just to say that in the last assessment report, the IPCC recognized the impact and the scale of loss and damage. Next slides. And this slide is just to give you an overview of the history of loss and damage under the UNFCCC. So the demand for actually talk about loss and damage started by small islands states in 1991, actually, but it was really, it took a long time before their demands were heard. And so it was only in 2013 that there was a first mechanism put in place called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. But it was really mostly to talk about what is loss and damage, gather information, gather exchange of practices and so on. So it didn't really address provide responses to loss and damage. And so that the demands for finance for loss and damage and the mechanism to provide responses escalated. And then we get to CoP 27 finally in 2022, when there was the agreement to establish a fund dedicated for responding to loss and damage, which was then the following year operationalized in the sense that there was an agreement about the shape of the fund. But I'll get back to the fund, the status of the fund later. Next slide, please. But because it was in this journey, so when there was the creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism, this language has been introduced of avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And so that's where things get confusing somehow, because the word avert is about avoiding risks, and it really links with mitigation, all actions that can be taken to really avoid loss and damage. And then minimize gets into reducing the impacts, and so that really overlaps with adaptation, early warning systems, anticipatory action, and so on. And what it was always missing in that infrastructure at the UNFCCC was enough responses on addressing loss and damage. So responding to what is out there, the harms that have happened and needed to be remedied. And so this is the part that the fund for loss and damage is supposed to provide responses, and is called actually funds for responding to loss and damage. Next slide, please. Just to say that the scale of needs is huge. There are different quantifications. One of the most used is the study from Marchianda Gonzalez Eguino. And so we talk about, this is used to say that an estimate at the moment is to talk about 400 billions per year of finance needed for loss and damage, which is probably gonna escalate much more in the future. Next slide, please. And so the latest, so on the one hand, you have these huge needs. And then what do we have at the moment in terms of finance? Yes, the fund was established, but the pledges that came in at the beginning in COP 28 in 2023, and then a few additional pledges at last COP, we only get to 740 millions. And of these, only 227 are actually held so far in the trusts funds of the funds. So it's really an uphill battle. And then last year at COP, there was a decision on a new collective quantified goal for climate finance. But very disappointingly, it was only 300 million, sorry, I said in the slide I said million, but it's billions, per year by 2035. But actually the decision doesn't even explicitly mention that this finance is supposed to also cover loss and damage. And in this, we have a very challenging geopolitical and financial context at the moment. So all this puts a lot of stress and also put in question the real will of countries when they created the funds to actually really deliver solutions that provides responses to people in needs. Next slide, please. And so just zooming in on the funds, as I said, last year was mostly spent in setting up the basics, the procedural elements, setting up the board and the secretariat and so on. And now really the fund is under pressure to start delivering something on the ground. And so it is now trying to work out a proposal for a startup phase. The startup phase is due to last for 2 years. And then also very associated to that is the discussion around access modalities, which is basically who can access funds and how. Next slide, please. This is so the Secretariat of the Funds, which is at the moment is tiny, is still under construction, the Secretariat itself, has put forward a proposal for a startup phase that was distributed and consulted this week. So here you have different elements of the startup phase. They're going to propose what type of early interventions they can do and through which funding modalities and which financial instruments and how the resources can be allocated, at least initially. Next slide. But sorry, this is just I have to say, this is just a proposal. Then they're going to put forward, they've been consulting with board members, with civil society, and now they're going to put forward another proposal, a revised proposal by the 25th of March, so next week. And this is going to be what the board is going to discuss at its next meeting, which is happening between the 8th and the 11th of April. And so just to conclude on identifying the opportunities for influencing in this context, so the proposal from the Secretariat identifies that the priority is to do bottom-up country-owned programming. And so they want to do through rapid disaster, so both respond to rapid disaster and slow onset, targeting both economic and non-economic loss and damages, and programming the focus on recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So still quite broad, basically is for countries to decide what they want to focus on. And then they're putting forward 3 funding modalities for the startup phase, which is programmatic approaches for long-term needs for responding to loss and damage. So basically, either country governments or specific agencies that have can put forward a proposal for funding that are basically, they can show that is a program of work that is quite broad and respond to broad country needs, or also rapid disbursements for rapid interventions through direct budget support. And then also prioritizing technical assistance for strengthening country-led programming for responding to loss and damage. And here they specify that the technical assistance is going to be mostly for readiness, so how to prepare countries to actually access, countries or entities to actually access funds. And what was quite disappointing is that there is no, in this proposal, there's no provision of small grants for communities or more broadly community access is not included or mentioned. And so we all need to collectively step up our advocacy for this. I know that cash is not, it doesn't equate with community access, but is somehow overlaps a bit. So I think it's important to think through how both how you can push for cash through these proposed modalities, but also how we can push for community access more generally through these different modalities. And keep talking about the community-led approaches as well. And then also access modalities in startup phase. Basically, they are saying that they want to take all the entities that were accredited to the Green Climate Funds and Adaptation Fund and GEF, and say that more or less they can all be accredited to the Fund for Loss and Damage, so without having to go through a new process. And then also they're going to put forward the process for it's a sort of a light accreditation process for other entities that were not accredited to those those other funds. And so designing a process that is not very cumbersome. So this is still work in progress. And I think here we need to figure out how we want to push and advocate for prioritizing entities that have a practice of providing cash, but also a practice of ensuring community access, also in this startup phase. Thank you. That's it.
Great, thank you very much, Chiara. So Chiara, by the way, is the Senior Climate Justice Advisor for Oxfam. So thank you for giving us an overview and talking us through the opportunities of using cash and vouchers, especially in defining what we mean by bottom-up approaches and cumulative approaches to loss and damage. Our next speaker will is Isabel Pelid, and she will walk us through on the cash and for loss and damage discussion. So, Isabel, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Sarah, for that whistle-stop tour, and also for some great food for thought already for our submission to the board, which we can discuss shortly. I'll be very brief because I want to leave time for Jemima and Chris to share their reflections. So next slide, please. But just, okay, so in our submission to the board, and as many of you, but perhaps not all on the call know, because I know we have a mixture of cash and climate experts here, there's really substantive experience of using cash transfers, particularly in humanitarian crises, also as part of social protection programs, and increasingly to achieve climate-related outcomes, namely adaptation and resilience, as well as to prepare households ahead of a shock through anticipatory action and help them recover from shocks. So that's the kind of grounding with which we're making. Sorry, can I see Andy can't hear me properly? Can others hear me okay?
We can hear
Sorry
you.
about that. Okay, apologies. I'll just get as close as I can. Sorry. So that's the grounding that we directly used for conceiving in partnership with the government of Scotland, and with thanks to Jemima, who's on the call, and working closely with the government of Malawi for using all this experience of what we know works in terms of cash transfer programming, particularly for humanitarian work, and using this as a basis for designing what a loss and damage program could look like. And so the specificities of this program, it was in response to Cyclone Freddy in Malawi, in which occurred in 2023, and the program was rolled out in 2024. And we supported households to relocate to land which was designated by the government as being appropriate for relocation, given the land where people lived before was no longer livable or usable for agricultural purposes. Just to clarify a couple of the kind of key characteristics of this program, which distinguishes it from, let's say, typical humanitarian or social protection cash programs. Firstly, I will just move whilst I talk. My apologies. Firstly, it really prioritize a values-based understanding of loss and damage, and so really intended to address the economic and non-economic losses, which Chiara has just talked us through. And relatedly, we supported the relocation of the entire community rather than just individuals, so targeting based on the losses and damages collectively incurred, and with the intent of really keeping the community social tissue, rather than just targeting based on individual vulnerability. And then the transfer itself was intentionally large enough to have this transformative impact and cover basic needs, reconstruction, recovery, which, as Chiara mentioned, is sort of critical to what the board is now looking for. Next slide, please. So, and apologies for previously for the noise. I'm very conscious of time, so I don't want to dwell on this too much, but yeah, just to highlight that on the back of this case study, we developed with some funding from the Irish government, firstly a sort of comprehensive case study of the experience, as well as a set of principles on what effective programming, effective loss and damage programming can look like, using loss and damage as a using cash transfer, sorry, as a foundation. So I'm just copying the link to both the case study and the principles documents here, so please familiarize yourself with them. Next slide, please. This is just a summary of the principles, and the idea is that for those who are familiar with cash, you might think this is all very familiar, but we acknowledge that within the climate space, there's less experience on cash, and so we're really trying to demonstrate, as I said, like what good loss and damage programming can look like, and exactly how cash can fulfill that in practice. And the one I really want to highlight is the one in the middle there, in the middle of the second column, which is cover all losses and damages experienced. And this is as I really want to emphasize the sort of key distinguishing feature of how we're conceptualizing cash for loss and damage. Next slide, please. So just to highlight that we're not saying there's like just one approach to doing this. And so the principles highlight a number of the trade-offs to consider in design. And I think those will be important for the FRLD and then for implementers to consider in terms of, particularly when we're thinking about different types of shocks and the time available to be able to design and implement those programs. Next slide. And so finally, we concluded with a call to action to the key kind of policy and funding stakeholders in this space, including for the fund itself, asking them to recognize direct cash transfers as an effective tool for addressing loss and damage and build systems to support cash response. And so the paper that I'll share shortly, I'll share it in the chat now, is effectively following up on that and providing concrete recommendations to the board based on the key decisions that are going to be made in April and that Chiara highlighted. Thanks. Back to CoP colleagues.
Great. Thank you very much, Isabel, for walking us through the opportunities and principles on cash and loss and damage. Now we will have hear reflections from our panel of experts. We have Jemima Gordon-Duff, who is the Deputy Director for International Climate Change Division with Scottish Government. She has worked with the UK's Foreign Office and Department for International Development for over 20 years, with most of her time spent overseas. She's heading up ICC in her current position. Jemima and her team leads on the trebling of the SG's Climate Justice Fund and loss and damage policy, with Scotland becoming the first global north country to provide funding to communities in the global south already impacted by climate change. And we'll also hear reflections from Chris Chama, one of the technical advisors of CoP Network, cash and market specialist, currently of CoP, and leading on localization and locally led CVA group cash transfers and co-leads on gender and inclusion. Prior to her current role as technical advisor, Chris was the MENA Deputy Regional Rep with the CoP Network, and previously has worked with Oxfam, the Lebanese Red Cross, and as an independent consultant. So now we will here on with few reflections from Jemima and Chris, and maybe a key overarching questions for Jemima and Chris is on we wanted to hear your thoughts on what do you think are the key things that the funds in response to local loss and damage boards should know about cash. Just a reflection generally on those things. So maybe I'll give the floor first to Jemima.
Thanks, Michael. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, very well.
Oh, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's good morning from me. I'm based in Scotland, but I'm not sure it's good morning for everyone on the call. So nice to see some familiar faces here. Chiara, thanks so much for that presentation. One I think I'll have to steal and give to our ministers at some point. From just a quick summary for Scottish Government's kind of engagement on loss and damage. So we were at COP26, we were the first global North government to give funding to address loss and damage. So just referring back to Chiara's slides, we were very clear that it was about addressing, not the minimise, not the avert, but the thing that no one else wanted to talk about. And I think that's one thing to bear in mind, is that particularly in the current context, that subnationals are often smaller, but California is the 5th largest economy in the world. But they can play that kind of slightly niche role and go places that parties to the UN feel less comfortable going. So it was Scotland, along with Wallonia, that gave the first funding to loss and damage. So especially as we see the space being ceded by parties, we see the US stepping back, we see ODA reducing across various funders. I think there is a potential for subnationals to step up and fill that role. What's trickier is for subnationals to fill the gap left in terms of financing, because not all of them have the devolved powers to provide international financing. Scotland does, but I think we are quite unusual, but it's something Scotland's exploring through our subnational partnerships with other subnational governments to see who else could provide international climate finance in some way or other. So that's kind of my first point is remember subnationals, we can be quite subversive, and that can be quite handy. So my second point is about for Scotland, our focus is on communities. So really disappointing that the proposal for the fund to respond to loss and damage doesn't include anything about direct access to communities, because that's something that we have used all our funding for. So we've pledged 10 million to loss and damage, and actually I think it's fully committed, so we're not part of that. I always hate those ratios, the 741 pledged versus the 227 received. So we've done it outside of the fund to respond to loss and damage. We did it before it was set up, because we wanted to demonstrate tangible, practical action, so with Give Directly being one of our main partners. But that's fully committed, and the idea being that our money goes directly to communities and is in grants, not loans. So good to see that that's made its way into some of the thinking for the proposal for the board. And the other kind of point from that we've done with our funding is about targeting it on marginalised groups to ensure that the funds, the support we're providing is reaching women, youth, persons with disability, Indigenous groups. And I think in terms of, maybe we just haven't got to that yet, but it'd be good to discuss that further, because I think particularly cash transfers can play a really pivotal role in empowering women. And that making sure that that's part of the argument. So we were looking at COP28 for the new climate finance goal to include specific measurement of how much of the funding went to women and other marginalised groups, which obviously didn't happen. But I still think it's something we can be talking about and advocating for as well. I'll stop there so that there's lots of time for Chris as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jamiwa, for your insights. Really useful. Now I'll give the floor to Chris. Chris, we have heard from the presentations on bottom-up country-owned programming. We wanted to hear your thoughts on what do you think are the synergies and learning on the group that you are leading on, especially between group cash transfers and community grants. What do you think potentially be the opportunities on these tools?
Thanks, Michael, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I've just dropped a quick link in the chat on our latest publication around a few definitions. So let me just start with definitions, because I think it's really important that we're aligned on a few components. So I just wanted to talk to you a bit today about group cash transfers, which are a mode of aid that provide transfers that usually value between $200 to $7,000 to groups that may be emerging, self-mobilizing, or have existed. But the underscore of all of the work that we need to talk about is how we actually work with communities. And so while group cash transfers is a mode of aid, adopting a supporting community-led response approach, an SCLR approach, is a key denominator to ensuring that the impact, the trust and the transfer of control is very real when working with communities. And it is pivotal in how the outcomes are experienced, translated, and how long they last. So I've been listening to a lot of these, to the great presentations today, but also I've been reading a bit about it. And I think it's really important to shed light on the fact that GCTs can play a very interesting role in loss and damage by enabling and empowering communities and equipping them with resources to provide creative, realistic solutions that last and that make sense for their cultures, for their communities, in different stages. So just to give you a broad reading of the scale of GCTs globally, and obviously we don't have a full mapping for this, but through the group cash transfers sub-working group that I co-lead on with other colleagues, we do, as of last year, we had noted 38 projects across 20 different countries. And these are only the projects that we were able to pick up on. But their objectives ranged everywhere from emergencies to response after a crisis, to recovery, to resilience. And a lot of these components and projects actually had overlapping, are quite similar to loss and damage coverages. I can say without a doubt that across the board, regardless of the nature of the response, be it within conflict, emergency, or in recovery settings, key similarities that came up was the increased self-reliance and resilience of communities to be able to address their immediate needs, but also present longer-term positive impact in the form of skill development of individuals, shared resources, shared skill sets that enable different projects to be established. The market was revitalized in various ways. In various instances, social cohesion, conflict resolution was mentioned as key positive outcomes through group cash transfer programming. And this includes empowering and reaching marginalized groups, vulnerable groups. A lot of the group cash transfer target women-led groups directly, and there was a very interesting display of learning from a gender and inclusion lens and the positive impact that it had on sub-communities within a broader community. And I think that's really important to present and to discuss, which is a community is a very broad sense, but when we delve deeper into the layers, to the subgroups within communities, I think group cash transfers presents a very interesting strategy and approach when moving forward. Communities have preferred it. They have communicated in various ways through different learning processes that the positive impact is welcomed. Some even questioned why it wasn't done earlier. And it's just really important to just kind of highlight the importance of the shared accountability and responsibility that was born genuinely through the group cash transfers mode of aid. So yeah, I mean, I could share a lot of examples from different contexts, be it Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, the Philippines, and the flagship initiative, which underpins group cash transfers as a key response mechanism. But I'm mindful about time, so I'm just going to pause there. And I'd be happy to share a lot of resources with the group to recirculate. I'll just stop there for now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. And I think definitely so to me at least, it's quite clear in terms of like the connection and the opportunities to use group cash transfers, especially in addressing loss and damage, and the opportunities it brings to if you are to advocate for the use of CVA and GCT into the loss and damage discussions. I have just one last question for Jemima, and this may be a bit personal, coming from a country wherein we've basically are seeing the impact of climate change on a daily basis. But maybe good to hear from you, Jemima, in terms of like, and we're thankful that the Scottish government has been one of the first trailblazer in terms of providing resources to loss and damage. But how do we engage a broader base of funders and on loss and damage, and more specifically in the case of cash? How do we then make more for a case of for donors to provide resources to address loss and damage and in use of cash?
Thanks, Michael. I mean, if I had the answer to that, we wouldn't have that. We wouldn't need this meeting. So it's exactly. How do we get more money into loss and damage? I mean, from the Scottish Government perspective, it was COP26. It was Nicola Sturgeon. It was Eyes of the World, and this is where COPs have a valuable role to play, because people do, UAE made its contribution when it was hosting COP. It's really significant contribution to the fund. So that kind of global spotlight does make a difference. So the use of COPs, the use of that spotlight, that's very true, Chiara. Also our First Minister quite genuinely really believed in it. So, and that was her really quite personal view. And that has continued through her government, and she's no longer First Minister, and actually our subsequent First Ministers have absolutely held on to it. But it was really obvious when you spoke to her that she didn't just think of loss and damage as a moral responsibility, but she saw it as a debt, and she saw it as an obligation, which made it quite difficult to engage others in the global north who were scared off by that use of language. So I suppose that's one of my points is we talk in Scotland a lot about our moral responsibility and taking a human rights and justice based approach. And that seems to both be consistent with the values that we're promoting in Scottish Government, but also doesn't imply that reparation that actually does scare off quite a few others. So we found that kind of moral responsibility as useful language. In terms of how to engage and get more funding, I think in this context with reducing ODA and people in different governments all stepping back, it's really difficult. So it's not just development funds are under pressure. I think climate funds are under particular pressure, because you've got that sense of, well, why should I bother if no one else is bothering? And you've got that cash can be viewed by some as kind of irresponsible, or not that it can be easily misused. So all sorts of worries with cash transfers, the use of ODA for cash transfers to address loss and damage. So really quite up against it, I'd say. I think one of the key things that we can do will be around stories, and I kind of feel that that's slightly glib, but for a lot of governments anyway, you need to be able to explain this is what the money bought. It's that literal, how do I explain to the taxpayer that there was value? And putting, as a small government anyway, with small funds available, it was 2 million that we gave to loss and damage, tiny amounts. If you put money into a large UN fund, how are you going to track that and say it had impact and justify it? So that can be, so I think that why as well mosaic of options is important, that there are different means that governments can contribute, and that they're able to really tell that story and that individual story about the impact the funding has had. We have quite a prolific media in the UK who there's quite kind of banners of problems, but when you actually get down to individual woman giving birth on a migrant boat crossing the channel, everyone actually thinks that's awful. So when you get round to the person and the individual, I think you get far more of that public backing behind it, because I think a lot of this is going to be about engaging with with the public. But then I will finish, but I really, governments are only one part, and one really, and the multilateral development banks, I think, are vital, as is the private sector, and this idea of a global tax in some way. I think they're all really interesting initiatives, which is very hard to get going in the time frame that's needed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jemima, for that. And indeed, lots of opportunities as well, but it doesn't come with challenges now as we move forward. But We would want to move on with the next discussion, and this is specifically linking on to the question of what we can do next, and some of the few initiatives from Give Directly in terms of like the proposed messaging to the board, and how do we do that exactly. So I'll give back the floor to Isabel or Celine. Yeah, Isabel.
I think it's me. Thank you, Chris and Jemima. Those were really, really helpful reflections. And maybe I just want to sort of reflect on two takeaways from my perspective before going to the details of our submission. So one, relating to your kind of last point, Jemima, is sort of on the broader case for cash. And as you can imagine, in light of the events in the last couple of months, this has been something that Give Directly has been focusing on very intentionally, not just within the climate space, but more generally, you know, as the US government and potentially other governments really rethink their approach to aid, how can we make the case for cash, address concerns around, you know, traceability of use, etc., but also make, you know, the arguments around efficiency and effectiveness across a whole range of outcomes more sort of resonate more than ever, and have to make sure that they also kind of align with the more, let's say, populist agendas that we're seeing emerging. So yes, there may be some challenges to making that argument, but I also think that there's a real opportunity, and that's what we're trying to seize. And I think that opportunity is also there in the climate space. When, I mean, you know, across all funding streams, we should be looking for the most cost-effective solutions now more than ever. The other reflection I wanted to share, and this also builds on some of what the speakers shared during yesterday's webinar, is that although, as both Chiara and Jemima have reflected, it's very disappointing that at least in this kind of startup phase, there's no specific provision for community access. I wonder if the case that we can make is that the use of cash is as close as we can get to a community-driven intervention in the context of there not being a specific access window. And so one of the speakers yesterday said, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Cash, especially if designed, you know, in consultation with the communities and with the substantive transfer amounts, actually helps us get, you know, quite a long way in terms of community-driven approaches. So I hope that sort of resonates, and that's definitely something that I will make sure comes out in the paper more strongly. If we can go to the next slide, that would be great. So yeah, please could those of you who are familiar with Menti or not, just join the link that Celine has just shared, and use the code there, so 55942049. If you don't have time to contribute now, there will also be time to contribute between now and Monday, because there's a deadline to put feedback on this document. But for now, I'm just going to talk you through what is in our submission, in our draft submission to the board. And we're certainly going to be strengthening it based on the contributions of the speakers in this webinar and yesterday's. And I've already got quite a few ideas on how to make that stronger. And actually, thanks to Chiara, I have a better understanding of what is concretely on the table at the April meeting. I feel like that's been evolving, so now it's even clearer. So next slide, please. So just so you know, the sort of 5 parts to the document. There's some initial sections which are around the overall evidence base on cash. So again, this is trying to make the case for cash to an audience that might not be very familiar with it and might be kind of skeptical about the climate-related outcomes, and particularly emphasizing the importance of large cash transfers. Then we go on to the proof of concept for loss and damage, so spotlighting our partnership with the Scottish Government funding and the projects in Malawi, and introduce the principles that we launched at CoP. And then the next slide, please. We then basically make a more kind of explicit case on why the FILD should prioritize cash. So the fact that it addresses basic needs reconstruction and resilient recovery, that it mitigates economic losses in the short and long term, and it really should be a benchmark for cost efficiency. So the pilot program that we ran was at 80% efficiency for a relatively small scale program, So in theory, that could be higher, and we feel that that should be a benchmark against which all programs are compared. And that meant, just to be clear, that 80 cents in every dollar spent went directly into the hands of recipients. And then we're saying that it is relevant and scalable across access modalities, so that effectively governments should prioritize cash when they are directly accessing FRD funds. And then that cash should also be prioritized as part of community access, including group cash transfers for all the reasons that Chris has just shared. And finally, that given the sort of systems and both the kind of financial systems and, let's say, government-run social protection systems where those exist in place, that actually cash is feasible for early interventions and can be scalable across extreme weather and slow onset events. So those are the main points that we're making, and in the document itself, you can see that there's more detail on that. Something that I'm reflecting on, and actually, Clara, it might be good to get your oral reflections on this or in writing, is whether we're like thinking enough around this concept of programmatic approaches and how cash might fit into that. And then also the technical assistance piece. Because something we're trying to emphasize is that there's a lot of expertise on cash transfers, primarily in the humanitarian sector, and that the fund and implementers of the funds should really draw on that. And so there's a kind of value proposition on behalf of humanitarian cash specialists around that. So now I'd like to kind of encourage you to access the Mentee, and you'll see that there's a number of questions. So one is, firstly, do you agree that the paper should focus explicitly on unconditional cash? There's a bit of debate around that, because perhaps there's more skepticism around unconditional cash for some of the reasons Jemima touched upon. But at the same time, we know that the evidence base is really strong in terms of the kind of flexible way in which I can deal with a range of climate impacts, and specifically in the case of loss and damage, deal with economic and non-economic losses. And then for different elements of the paper, we're asking you to indicate whether you sort of broadly agree or disagree with the kind of statements we've summarized in the Mentee. I don't know if has anybody managed to access, and if so, is it working for you? I can see that Annelise is struggling a bit.
We have person joining the Mentee. I see some up that's coming in. So I will wait a little bit. So the link is a bit earlier in the chat again, and you can use the code that you see on the slide.
You're also welcome to just enter the document and share more specific comments directly. We wanted to give people options.
While we wait, can I come in?
Yes, please, with pleasure.
Yeah, I just want to maybe bring you all up to speed to the advocacy that we're all doing, not all, but a lot of us are doing around the broad issue of community access, which is a big piece for a lot of organizations. So last year we did a joint letter to ask for the board for a community access program window, whatever, and we got more than 350 signatures. So now we're trying to see how we develop this advocacy. And we are clear that cash is some sort of overlaps with this, but we don't really want to equate cash with community access, because it might, a small grants provision could be directly supporting local NGOs that really needs and want to be at the forefront of responses for loss and damage. So the importance is sort of, if we can reinforce each other's on this advocacy and not really and go in the same direction without, because so if you say in the submission that maybe in this context, cash is as much as close as possible if you can go to community access, it could maybe undermine a bit the argument for a broader community access approach. So I think that we haven't lost the battle yet. So at this moment, we still can campaign for a broader approach, and then we need to. But in parallel, we also need to find ways to put this message across all the different modalities that are shaping up. But yeah, happy to continue discussing.
Just building on that, what would you suggest as kind of optimal language that recognizes how that cash can be, really clear example of a community-driven modality, which is, highly cost efficient, but whilst not kind of undermining, because in my mind, it's also, you're talking about like local organizations accessing grants. I still, what I envisage is that there could be an orientation, let's say, from the fund to say, as much as possible, the use, those organizations should consider doing cash transfers as well.
Yeah, we could think. I think we should discuss later, but so I don't have a full answer here, and it requires more thinking. But it's also it's more complicated than that. Yes, we could say, okay, the cash is definitely a response that even local organization can consider, but they might, we also saying, to foster local leadership, you also need to provide long-term flexible core funding. So it's more complicated. There is also so I think our sense is that even saying they should prioritize cash in this context could be a bit tricky. It's definitely, the submission needs to talk about using cash as a key tool and making this very strong, but saying prioritize cash in early intervention could a bit undermine the arguments. But obviously I understand that this is the priority for this group. So, but we can see how we could reinforce each other maybe.
Yeah, thank you. And I like the suggestion that Jemima's made in the chat. I'm also just, and I've seen, and I'll make sure I can contribute to the community access document as well. Sorry, I hadn't seen the two questions from Frederick and Anna, so perhaps I'll answer those. And then what we can do is we'll analyze the results of the Mentimeter separately, and then I'll pass on to the CalC team to wrap up. So the question from Frederick, how to give directly right cash transfer value for the MD project. So to be very honest, it was based on our experience of other types of programs that are intended to have a marked impact on addressing extreme poverty, and which are typically around $1,000 per household, at least they have been in Malawi. And we knew that had enabled people to meet their basic needs, to invest in productive assets, and to invest in livelihoods improvements or diversification to have marked impacts on income. So we kind of adapted that somewhat. And then actually what we learned from the Irish funded evaluation is that we should have made the transfer larger, and in order to kind of really hit that basic needs recovery and reconstruction sort of trio, if you like, of goals. And so in the principles, we share some reflections on how the transfer value might be calculated, and kind of weighing up, let's say, more detailed quantified approaches that might be more time consuming versus more kind of let's say community-led approaches, which might be a bit more approximative, but potentially kind of faster. Anyway, you can see in the principles some of the kind of trade-offs there, and there's no perfect approach. Anna, you'll see in the principles, and sorry if it didn't come out, actually I realized it didn't come out sufficiently in today's presentation, but we're absolutely saying that social protection systems should be used as much as possible, wherever possible, and that, classically in any kind of parallel approach should be contributing to those systems. I think one of the challenges we have is that the amounts that we're talking about are very different to even shock responsive social protection payments where those exist. And so I think there's a sort of kind of political or ethical, if like, question around whether or not systems could flex to provide those larger amounts. Yeah, but that's definitely what we're advocating for, including in the submission. But I'd love you to get. I know this is your area of expertise, and I'd love you to add anything that you think is missing to the submission document. Thanks. And back to CoP maybe for a wrap up.
Yeah, I will wrap up because we're already over time. Thank you so much for all the feedback, really interesting. Please also, may you go to the slide before, sorry, Reina. Feel free to give feedback either on the main tier. I will definitely say that almost all of you want to move to unconditional and restricted cash, so definitely Annelise, what you put in chat, MPCA. About the next step, you please, if you have extensive feedback, etc., can you give them directly in the document or ping us so you have our contact in the presentation that will be shared very quickly. The idea is of everything ready by Monday, so we can then work on the full document by the 28th. And can you come to the slide before just to make sure that I give all the information about the next step? I'm sorry. Okay, no worries. Yeah, great. Yeah, so up to next Monday to give feedback, especially if you have red line or if you want to push something forward either on the mail or directly on the document. Of course, let us know if you are connected to other specific network so we can push a position. And also, please reach to us or use that document to ensure that we're all around the scope. We refer cash the same way, and we doesn't contradict any submission or anything. Yeah, once again, feel free to reach to Isabel, myself, Michael, Ruth, Chris, if you have further question. And thank you so much. And sorry, we are a bit late.
Thanks to our speakers in particular and to CoP. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you in our next webinar.